A woman calls her bank 11 days after burying her husband because a deposit that arrived on the 3rd of the month is gone again. Nobody stole it. Nobody made a mistake. It went back because of a rule written into Social Security law in 1939, and it is the one rule in this entire program that families almost never hear about until the week they are least able to deal with it. Social Security does not pay a benefit for the month a person dies. Not a partial month, not a prorated amount, nothing. Tonight we decode exactly how that works, what the family does about the payment that already arrived, the $255 that almost nobody claims in time, and what happens to a household that goes from 2 checks to 1. Let me start with the rule itself, because once you see the shape of it, everything else in this episode follows. To be paid a Social Security benefit for a given month, a person has to be alive for that entire month. Survive the whole month. The benefit is payable. Die on any day of that month, including the last day, and no benefit is payable for it. There is no proration. A person who dies on the 30th of a 30-day month receives nothing for those 29 days of living. That is not an oversight in the way the law was written. It is the law as written, and it has been sitting there since 1939, more than 8 decades, largely untouched while everything around it changed. Now here is the second piece, and this is the part that makes the first piece hurt. Social Security pays in arrears. That is a plain way of saying the money that lands in the account this month is payment for last month. The deposit that arrives in August is the benefit for July. Put the two rules together, and you get the situation the widow at the beginning ran into. Her husband died in July. The payment that arrived in early August was July's benefit. But he did not live through all of July, so July is not payable. So that August deposit, which felt like the last thing he ever provided for the household, has to go back. And it usually goes back automatically. When the death is reported, the agency asks the bank to return the payment, and banks do that quickly. So for a lot of families, nobody calls, nobody explains, the money simply disappears from the balance during the week of the funeral. I want to say clearly what this is and is not. It is not a mistake. It is not a penalty for anything. It is not the bank taking money. And it is not something a family did wrong by spending it, although that is exactly what a lot of people fear. But it can cause real harm in the short term, and that is what nobody prepares people for. If a household has already written checks against that deposit, for a funeral deposit, for the mortgage, for the utility bill, those checks can bounce 2 weeks after a death. That is a preventable disaster, and the way to prevent it is simply knowing this is coming. So here is the practical guidance, and it is the same for every family. When someone on Social Security dies, expect that the next payment either will not arrive or will arrive and then be pulled back. Plan the 2 weeks after the death without counting on it. If you have automatic bills tied to that account, and most households do, move the critical ones, or make sure there is a cushion in the account so a reversal does not knock over 3 other things. And if a payment does come back out and you were not expecting it, now you know what happened, and you do not need to spend an afternoon on the phone with the bank looking for fraud. 2 more details on this, because both come up constantly. First, what if the person died on the very last day of the month? The answer is still no benefit for that month. Living 29 of 30 days is the same as living 1 day, as far as this rule is concerned. I know how that lands. I am not defending it. I am telling you what it says, because knowing the rule is what lets you plan around it. Second, what if the payment was already spent? The family does not go to jail and nobody is accused of anything. The agency handles this as an overpayment, and there is a process for it, including the ability to explain the circumstances. What you should not do is ignore letters about it, because the process gets much harder when nobody responds. Now, let me get to the part of this that actually has money in it for the family, and that is the part almost nobody claims. There is a one-time lump sum death payment from Social Security. It is $255. I will let that number sit for a second. $255 against a funeral that in most of this country costs several thousand. That figure has been standing still for decades while everything else moved. But it is real money, and it is yours, and a surprising share of eligible families never receive it. So let us be precise about who gets it. The first claim belongs to a surviving spouse who was living in the same household as the worker at the time of death. That is the simplest case and the most common one. If the spouse was not living in the same household, they can still receive it, but only if they were already entitled to benefits on the deceased worker's record for the month of death. If there is no eligible spouse at all, the payment can go to a child of the worker who was eligible for benefits on that record in the month the worker died. That generally means a child under 18, a child aged 18 or 19 who is still a full-time student in elementary or secondary school, or an adult child with a disability that began before age 22. And now the part I would underline if I could underline out loud. You have 2 years from the date of death to claim it. 2 years. After that, it is gone permanently, and there is no appeal to make about a deadline you did not know existed. 2 years sounds like a long time when you hear it in a calm room. In practice, the first 6 months after a death disappear into paperwork and grief, and I have seen families discover this at month 26. Also, and this matters, it is a separate thing from monthly survivor benefits. Claiming one is not claiming the other, and in most cases it requires an actual application. Reporting a death is not the same as applying, and this is the trap. Many families assume the funeral home handled everything. A funeral home can report a death to the agency, and often does. But reporting the death is not the same as filing for the $255, and it is not the same as filing for survivor benefits either. Those are applications a family member has to make. So write this down as a single instruction. After a death, one call to Social Security, and in that call say 2 sentences. I would like to apply for the lump sum death payment, and I would like to know whether I qualify for survivor benefits on this record. That is it. Those 2 sentences are the entire difference between a family that receives what it is entitled to and a family that does not. Before we leave the lump sum, 3 situations come up often enough that they deserve their own answer. What if the person who died was not yet collecting Social Security? Survivor benefits can still exist for the family because they are built on the deceased worker's earnings record, not on whether that person had started claiming. Somebody who worked for decades and died at 63 without ever filing still leaves a record behind. So the 2 sentences on the phone apply exactly the same way, and this is a case where families very often assume there is nothing to ask about. What if the person was still working when they died? Same answer. The record is the record. Working at the time of death does not remove the family's ability to ask about survivor benefits, and it does not remove the lump sum. And what about the surviving spouse who is already receiving their own retirement benefit? That is not an obstacle to calling either. The agency looks at both, and the conversation is about which arrangement applies going forward. What you should not do is assume that because you already receive a check, there is nothing to discuss. One more thing that gets tangled up in this. Medicare and Social Security are administered together in a lot of people's minds, and one death triggers changes in both. Reporting the death to Social Security handles the Medicare side as well for the person who died. But if the surviving spouse was on a plan through the deceased spouse, or if premiums were being deducted from the check that is now stopped, that needs its own phone call. Do not assume premium payments continue quietly on their own when the check they came out of no longer exists. Now the third piece, and this is the one that changes the future rather than the week. A married household on Social Security is usually a 2-check household. 2 separate benefits arriving each month, built from 2 separate work records. When one spouse dies, that household does not keep both checks. It moves to a survivor arrangement, and the surviving spouse ends up with 1 benefit rather than 2. In the ordinary case, the one that remains is the larger of the 2, not the sum. Sit with what that means arithmetically. If one benefit was larger and the other smaller, the household budget loses the smaller one entirely, and every fixed cost stays exactly where it was. The rent does not have. The property tax does not have. The insurance on the house does not have. Utilities barely move because one person still heats the same number of rooms. This is the single most underestimated financial event in retirement, and it lands on people who are in no condition to do arithmetic. I am deliberately not putting percentages on the survivor benefit tonight because the amount depends on the age at which the survivor claims and on the record involved, and this channel has a dedicated episode on those rules. What I want you to take from tonight is the structure. 2 checks becomes 1. The one that stays is generally the bigger one, and the household bills do not shrink to match, which is why the useful version of this conversation happens while both people are alive. If you are a couple watching this together, here is the exercise, and it takes about 20 minutes at a kitchen table. Write down both monthly benefit amounts. Then cross out the smaller one and add up the household bills that would still exist. That number, the gap between the surviving check and the surviving bills, is the single most important number in your retirement plan, and most couples have never once calculated it. If the gap is small, you have your answer and you can relax about it. If the gap is large, you now know something specific and early, which means you have options that a widow in month 1 does not have. Delaying the higher earner's claim raises the amount that survives because the survivor benefit is built on that record. Life insurance, even a modest amount, becomes a very different conversation when you have an actual number for what it needs to cover. And decisions about the house, the second car, and where you want to live at 80 become questions you get to answer together, rather than under pressure in the worst month of somebody's life. Let me also cover the practical sequence in the first 2 weeks, because people ask for this and it is hard to find in one place. Report the death. The funeral home usually offers to do this, and it is fine to let them, but confirm it was done and get the date it was reported. Do not touch or spend the last payment if it has already arrived, and expect it to be reversed if it covers the month of death. Call Social Security and use those 2 sentences. Ask for the lump sum death payment and ask about survivor benefits on that record. Ask what happens to your own benefit if you are already receiving one. This is where the 2 check to 1 check change gets handled, and you want to hear it from them with your own numbers, not from a chart. Have documents ready. The death certificate, the marriage certificate if you are the spouse, both Social Security numbers, and a bank account. The list is shorter than people expect. And do not do all of this the day after the funeral. The 2-year window on the lump sum is generous by design, and the survivor benefit process is not a race to the same degree. What matters is that it gets done and that somebody in the family is tracking it, not that it happens in 72 hours. And one small piece of advice that has nothing to do with the rules and everything to do with how this actually goes. Pick the person in the family who will handle it in advance while both spouses are alive, not the person who is best with money. The person who is calmest on the phone. This is not complicated work, but it is the kind of work that goes badly when the person doing it is also the person who has not slept in a week. Writing one name on a page now saves a family a great deal of confusion later. Let me put the whole thing back together. No benefit is payable for the month of death, and that has been the rule since 1939. Because payments arrive a month behind, the deposit that shows up after a death usually has to go back, and it often goes back automatically during the worst week. There was a lump sum death payment of $255. It goes first to a spouse who shared the household, and it must be claimed within 2 years, or it is gone. Reporting a death is not the same as applying for anything, and a 2-check household becomes a 1-check household while the bills stay exactly where they were. None of this is a secret. It is all published in plain language on the agency's own pages. It is just that almost nobody reads those pages until the week they cannot read anything at all. That is the entire reason this episode exists. A necessary note. I am not an attorney, a financial advisor, or a Social Security representative, and this is general education rather than advice about your specific case. Rules and amounts can change. Individual situations vary a great deal, and the agency itself is the only authority on your record. Confirm your own circumstances directly with Social Security using the number on your own paperwork or at their official site. Now, I would like to hear from you, and I would ask for a bit of care in the comments tonight, because some of the people reading them are in the first month of this. If your family went through it, what surprised you most? And what do you wish somebody had told you before instead of after? If this helped, subscribe. The next one I would send you to is the episode on survivor benefits themselves, where we do put the numbers on what the remaining check actually becomes. I am your host at Social Security Decoded. Know the rule, then decide, not the other way around.